A Season on the Edge of Empire, Critical Reflections on Elias Winter's Last 20 Essays.
A review of my work by a machine, a mirror I didn't ask for. Over the past year, I published a body of essays here. I thought of them as dispatches, not a sequence. I didn't write them as a book. I didn't think they added up to something final or complete. Then I submitted the full text of the 20 essays to a neutral AI model, one that didn't know who I was or that I was the author. It had no prior context, no history, no search bar open in another tab. It simply read 20 of the last essays and answered a prompt. What do you think of this writer? What came back startled me, not because it was flattering, though parts are, but because it found structure I didn't plan, themes I hadn't named, and patterns I'd only vaguely sensed. It laid them out with precision, and it did so without needing to believe or agree. In that sense, it did what I've long said language should do: reveal more than it intends. I share the result below. Not because I endorse every sentence, I don't. And not because I think the machine understood me better than readers, but because I believe this: if even an artificial mind, without biography or bias, finds coherence and urgency in these essays, then maybe they do cohere. Maybe they matter. Read the piece. Then reread the essays if you're inclined. Or don't. But consider the quiet implication that what we say, when said clearly, might one day outlive the moment that made us say it. Elias.
Introduction. Over the span of 20 essays published in recent months on language matters, Elias Winter has crafted a body of work that reads like an extended moral inquiry into the maladies of our age. These pieces range from scathing political diagnosis to lyrical meditations on longing, yet they cohere around a single mission: to strip away comforting illusions and confront readers with unvarnished truths. Winter writes, by his own account, pieces that demand attention, not agreement, eschewing easy consolation or tribal applause. In an era of fragmented discourse, his essays form a sustained argument that clarity is a form of resistance, an antidote to the lullabies for adults who cannot bear to wake up, which so often substitute for honest speech. The question, then, is whether these 20 essays achieve a sense of completion in fulfilling that mission. Do they offer something original or nourishing to the public intellect or spirit? And beyond the fervor of the present moment, might Winter's work endure? What follows is a critical synthesis of those final 20 essays. It traces the internal coherence of Winter's themes and the evolution of his tone, from prophetic rage to elegiac contemplation, while examining the dialectical interplay of emotion, intellect, and moral fervor in his writing. Across these essays, Winter dissects the language of power and the power of language, excavates the psychological toll of digital life, resurrects lessons from history, and wrestles with the ache of spiritual hunger. The result is a collection as formally varied as it is intense: polemics studded with literary allusion, narrative scenes shading into philosophical argument, jeremiads that crescendo into prayers. Taken together, they present a singular voice issuing a grave but hopeful challenge: to see through the comforting mirages of our time and seek a more honest reckoning with reality. In assessing the completeness, originality, and lasting value of this work, we must attend closely to its ideas, its progression, and its carefully honed language. The mission, language, power, and the refusal of illusion. From the very first of these essays to the very last, Winter's preoccupation is clear: to interrogate how language is used to mask or reveal truth. He perceives contemporary American society, the edge of empire, as his publication's subtitle suggests, as a place where language collapses and systems fail unless met with fierce clarity. Each essay, in its own way, seeks to reclaim words from propaganda and inertia, often by exposing the gap between official narratives and lived reality. In The Mother of the Demon We Fed, for example, Winter delivers a blistering critique of political euphemism through the figure of Vice President Kamala Harris. He argues that Harris and her cohort speak the dialect of consequence-proof politics, where words are gauze and accountability is a myth, treating crises as PR problems and public anger as something to be managed with spin. The essay's thesis is that such hollow rhetoric isn't merely unproductive, it actively corrodes democracy. This is how democracies corrode, Winter warns, through a managerial priesthood that confuses absolution with an email blast. Here and elsewhere, he insists that language untethered from truth becomes a narcotic, inducing a comfortable stupor even as material conditions decay. The demon in that essay's title is not any one politician or demagogue, but the pent-up public rage that grows in the shadow of elite impunity, a monster midwifed by years of euphemism and denial. Winter's mission, then, is to refuse the narcotic. Each essay is an act of linguistic detox, an attempt to strip away consolation and force into open view the hard realities that words too often obscure. This mission finds varied targets. In The Mandate for the Few, Winter scrutinizes how ideology calcifies into orthodoxy. He describes modern propaganda not as crude deception, but as a kind of secular liturgy, a ritualized repetition of reassuring falsehoods by those in power. There is a way a nation learns to pray without knowing it is praying. Not to God, but to power, he writes in that piece. What used to be called propaganda, in Winter's view, has become the lie as liturgy, a catechism of talking points endlessly repeated until ritual becomes truth. It's a characteristically original formulation, to cast think tank memos and partisan slogans as items of faith, and it crystallizes a core concern that runs through many essays: the quasi-religious fervor with which societies cling to comforting narratives. Whether the context is the Heritage Foundation's agenda, as in Mandate for the Few, or the Democratic establishment's self-justifications, as in the Harris essay, Winter finds a common pathology, a refusal to speak plainly about failure, wrapped in a self-satisfied conviction that repeating the old lines is enough. In response, his essays strive to be an antidote, a form of secular sermon that upends false piety. Winter often adopts, in fact, the tone of a fiery preacher, albeit one with a political economist's precision. He doesn't hide his rage of a prophet at corruption or his mourning of a poet at what is being lost. Though these phrases appear on his Substack about Page, the content of the essays themselves bears them out in substance and style. The through line of all 20 pieces is a morally charged insistence that meaning must be reclaimed from those who would cheapen it. In this sense, the body of work has an unmistakable unity of purpose. Internal coherence through thematic progression. If Winter's overarching mission is consistent, the essays approach it from a kaleidoscope of angles: political, technological, historical, personal, which together give the work a rich internal coherence. One finds recurring motifs and analogies that create resonance between disparate topics. A prime example is Winter's exploration of performance versus reality. In Ballroom for a Swan King, ostensibly a commentary on a proposed White House renovation, Winter turns a news item into an allegory of power's vanity. Governments that cannot solve real problems, he suggests, instead build spectacles. The talking points keep changing, but the gesture does not. Build a ballroom large enough to quiet the doubt. We don't expand rooms to celebrate, we expand them to drown out what we can't govern, he observes wryly. He then juxtaposes this contemporary folly with the tale of Bavaria's Swan King, Ludwig II, who bankrupted his kingdom-building fairy tale castles as personal escape. In Ludwig's story, Winter finds a mirror of the present. Both Neuschwanstein and the East Wing Ballroom are architectures of anesthesia. When you cannot hold the world, you enlarge the room. The historical analogy deepens the critique, and it rhymes with other essays' insights. The idea of governance as theater recurs in The City and the Question, where Winter recounts how ancient Athens, reeling from war and plague, turned political debate into hollow performance. In the Agora, the city pretended to be one mind, even as fatigue and factionalism reigned. Across millennia and contexts, Winter discerns the same temptation. When genuine unity or competence is lacking, leaders reach for cosmetic grandeur and scripted unity. These essays thus speak to each other, forming a sustained meditation on the gap between appearance and reality in public life. Another theme binding the collection is the flood of information as a force of suppression. Winter repeatedly returns to the notion that modern people are drowned in noise that passes for knowledge. In The Algorithm and the Anxious Class, he narrates a day in the life of a contemporary everyman whose every moment is mediated by algorithmic prompts, notifications, and life hacks. The portrait is unnervingly intimate. He tells himself he's multitasking. He's actually multi-escaping, Winter writes, as the protagonist flits between work tasks and algorithm-curated distractions. By midday, the man is purchasing products to soothe anxieties that the very same media feeds stoked moments before. The cumulative effect is a state of paralysis through overstimulation. Tired in a way sleep won't fix. Though Winter doesn't explicitly cite it in these last 20 essays, one hears echoes of his earlier concept from a prior piece, that truth drowns not by outright censorship, but by noise. This idea surfaces implicitly in Subscriptions to the End of the World, where the late-night doomscroller finds every fear monetized and amplified. Your laptop screen is a lighthouse for moths, and you are the moth with a credit card, he writes, capturing how sensational headlines about hyperinflation tonight or ocean on fire again seduce the anxious mind. In Winter's view, the algorithmic content flood is not trivial entertainment. It's a fundamental new form of social control, one that trades deliberate silence for overwhelming chatter. By including such examinations of digital life alongside essays on political or historical subjects, Winter enlarges his critique of language collapse to the realm of technology and media. The pieces cohere in showing a society where meaning is siphoned away, in politics by mendacious spin, and in culture by a cacophony of triviality and alarm. Yet if this sounds bleak, Winter's work is anything but numb. The very form of his essays, dense with insight, enriched by history and literature, stands as a rebuke to the flattening of discourse he describes. In making readers slow down and grapple with first principles, he enacts the antidote to the conditions he laments. Tonal evolution and literary craft. One striking quality of these essays is their tonal range, which nonetheless forms an intentional progression. Winter can write with incendiary force, but he also knows when to lower the flame to an ember. Early in the sequence, in the context of this last 20, we see him at his most scathing and analytical. Later, his voice becomes more ruminative, even elegiac. This shift gives the collection a sense of journey, as if the author, having anatomized society's ills, gradually turns inward to seek resolution or grace. The literary care with which Winter modulates his tone is a mark of the work's seriousness and artistry. At the more polemical end of the spectrum are pieces like The Mother of the Demon We Fed. Here, Winter's prose lunges and strikes. His sentences are quick and barbed, dripping with irony. He skewers political cliches about qualifications and historic firsts, arguing that such phrases have become empty incantations masking incompetence. Harris, he writes, has been present for many meetings where nothing true was said, hence most qualified, and her speeches amount to an atmosphere, earnest, empathic, antiseptic, until the oxygen leaves the room and only slogans remain. The indignation is palpable, but it's channeled through precise metaphors, words as gauze, politicians as a managerial priesthood. Winter's language in these critiques often carries a literary pedigree. One catches the cadence of scriptural oratory and the elusive bite of satire. Notably, he draws religious imagery subversively, describing Harris as our high priestess of vibes and vacancy, presiding over a liturgy of forgetting, or suggesting that when a society's stewards refuse accountability, the public hires an executioner in the form of demagogic backlash. Such turns of phrase elevate what could have been a mundane op-ed into something closer to a sermon or extended aphorism. The result is an intellectual argument delivered at the temperature of moral urgency. Winter's early tone essays sear themselves into the reader's mind with their combinations of high-voltage rhetoric and conceptual clarity. Midway through the 20 essays, a noticeable tonal broadening occurs. Winter begins to experiment with narrative and historical excursus as vehicles for his ideas. Ballroom for a Swan King, for instance, is suffused with dark humor even as it criticizes power. The essay opens almost lightly, with a first-person confession about home renovation projects and a jab that any marriage surviving a DIY renovation is an achievement. But the playful surface belies a deadly serious point that emerges through the extended analogy with King Ludwig II. By recounting Ludwig's fantastical castle building, he preferred Wagner to cabinet meetings, myth to minutes. In parallel with Washington's penchant for symbolic modernization, Winter achieves a tone of tragicomedy. The absurdity of leaders, whether a Bavarian monarch or a democratic government, trying to build their way out of spiritual or political crisis, provides a certain grim laughter. And yet, as the essay concludes, the tone turns somber and lyrical. Winter describes swans gliding across a Bavarian lake at dusk, like white commas, in a sentence the mountain keeps refusing to end. The image is haunting, as is the final lesson he draws from Ludwig's fate, that an empty spectacle can outlast its dreamer and be monetized by the very society that condemned his excess. This blend of wit, narrative detail, and elegiac reflection showcases Winter's range as a writer. It also marks a transition. The later pieces increasingly seek catharsis or insight rather than just indictment. In the final cluster of essays, Winter's voice turns inward and poetic, as if moving from prophecy to contemplation. Mirage, the very last essay in the set, and one of the shortest at 5 minutes, reads almost as a prose poem. Gone is any trace of political reference. Instead, we find a meditation on desire and the human condition. There comes a time in every life when desire turns to light, not revelation, but the hollow shimmer that dances over sand. The piece begins, immediately establishing a mythic, timeless register. Winter invokes the classical image of the mirage in the desert as a metaphor for life's pursuits. Far from the caustic tone of earlier essays, here he is gentle, philosophical, even tender. The essay suggests that much of what we chase in life is destined to remain out of reach. Most of what we chase was never meant to be found. Yet it insists this futile seeking is itself meaningful. Without illusion, no one would keep walking. Without the shimmer, truth would kill us too soon, Winter writes, paradoxically praising our mirages as necessary mercy. In the end, even the mirage becomes grace when one accepts that the journey is about surrender rather than arrival. The tone here is achingly sincere, with echoes of mystical literature. That Winter chooses to end his sequence of essays on such a note is telling. After dissecting so many false hopes, false political promises, false digital consolations, he does not leave us in cynicism. Instead, he points to a fierce tenderness in this futility of human striving. It's as if, Having demanded that we see the truth without anesthetic, Winter acknowledges the soul's thirst for meaning and offers a final, quiet affirmation that continuing to hope, even on the edge of a desert, is holy in its own way. This tonal evolution from fiery critique to reflective grace gives the collection a narrative arc. It feels composed in the musical sense, with movements that rise to crescendos of anger and descend to adagios of introspection. The literary craftsmanship is evident not only in the choice of metaphors and historical allusions, but in the very structure of the reading experience. By the end, the reader senses a certain closure, not that all problems are resolved, but that the inquiry has reached a natural resting point. Winter has led us through the inferno of modern follies and into a kind of purgatorial clearing where one can at least see the stars, or the mirages, for what they are. As a work of prose, these essays exhibit a high order of formal compression and care. They reward multiple readings. As Winter predicted, they travel in private rereads, marked paragraphs, awkward dinners, and decisions made when no one is watching. In this respect, the work's tone and form reflect its substance. It is writing designed to last, not to flash. Emotional, intellectual, and moral dialectic. A hallmark of Winter's essays is their ability to operate on emotional, intellectual, and moral levels simultaneously. They are not dry treatises, nor are they mere emotive outpourings. Rather, they braid personal feeling, rigorous thought, and ethical conviction into a single strand. This dialectical interplay gives the essays much of their force. Readers find themselves moved and enlightened in tandem, the heart quickening even as the mind is engaged in reflection. If we ask whether Winter's work adds something original, meaningful, or useful to public discourse, the answer lies partly in this multidimensional approach. He manages to speak to the whole person, our rational faculties, our conscience, and our capacity for empathy and wonder. Consider The One You Walk Past, a story-like essay that unfolds on a city street. On the surface, it's a simple recollection. The narrator rushes to a meeting on a blustery morning and briefly encounters an old man carrying a bag of oranges. Initially, the narrator dismisses the stranger. "I already know your kind," he tells himself, internally classifying the man as a harmless eccentric to be avoided. Winter's prose here captures with uncomfortable accuracy that automatic, cold calculation we make to steer clear of others' needs. The small betrayals we make add no weight to our pockets. They just keep the day light enough to carry, he notes pointedly, after the narrator pointedly avoids engaging. In that single aphorism lies a moral indictment. Our convenience is purchased at the cost of our humanity, yet we hardly notice the transaction. The essay then delivers its emotional and intellectual payoff through a gentle twist. The narrator sees a photograph in a cafe of a famous physicist, unmistakably Albert Einstein, who lived in that town, depicted as an old man with uncombed hair, bag in hand, looking much like the very stranger just encountered. The recognition triggers shame and wonder in the narrator. Suddenly, the faceless old man is suffused with significance, as if he could be a Einstein of our day incognito, or at least a reminder that every person carries untold stories. The essay ends without a dramatic confrontation or reconciliation. The narrator does not run out to apologize or befriend the man. Instead, Winter leaves us in a reflective melancholy. The narrator watches the old man depart once more, noting how our eyes met a second time, longer now, because glass makes courage for both sides, and offers only a silent nod and raised coffee cup in lieu of the conversation he could have started. The emotional effect is subtle but profound. We feel the narrator's regret, the weight of what was not said. Intellectually, we grasp the point, how easily and routinely we dehumanize others. But we grasp it because Winter made us feel it first. The moral of the story is not delivered as a lecture. It emerges from a quiet human moment that the reader recognizes in her own life. In this way, Winter's fusion of the emotional, the pathos of the missed connection, the intellectual, the recognition of one's own bias, and the broader implications for society's capacity for empathy, and the moral, the gentle exhortation to see those we would walk past, yields an insight that is both useful and meaningful. It calls the reader to a small but significant form of action, a change in perspective, a second thought at the next street corner. A similar dynamic is at play in Winter's essays on technology and media. The Algorithm and the Anxious Class, though presented as an analytical case study of one man's day, carries a strong undercurrent of emotional truth. Anyone who has felt their attention splintered by the endless digital scroll or their anxiety momentarily salved by an online purchase will recognize themselves in Winter's protagonist. The narrative technique, describing hour by hour the little decisions and dopamine hits, creates a sense of empathy, even entrapment. We watch this man click and consume, and we feel his shallow satisfactions and mounting stress. Winter's occasional asides deliver the intellectual skeleton key to this emotional scenario. He tells himself he's multitasking. He's actually multi-escaping. The attention of strangers buoys him for 5 minutes at a time. These lines distill the psychology of the social media era in memorable epigrams. They are useful intellectually, giving names to the phenomena millions experience. But they land with impact because the essay has immersed us in the lived texture of the problem. Morally, Winter doesn't preach in this piece. He doesn't need to. By holding up an unforgiving mirror to modern work life and content consumption, he invites us to judge for ourselves whether this is an existence we wish to continue leading. The unspoken ethical question haunts the brisk, compulsive rhythm of the prose. Are we complicit in our own oppression by these algorithms? In dramatizing the inner life of the anxious class, Winter effectively says, "Look at what we've become. Is this acceptable?" Without moralizing, he manages to moralize in the deepest sense by reawakening the reader's conscience and capacity for self-interrogation. Even Winter's overtly political essays carry this triple register of head, heart, and moral spine. His anger is often laced with sorrow. The intellectual disappointment in failed leadership is paired with an almost personal sense of betrayal or grief for what could have been. In the Harris essay, Beyond the Barbs, one senses a mournful concern for the country. Lines like, "Those are not policies. Those are lullabies for adults who cannot bear to wake up," carry a mix of scorn and pity. Winter's outrage is, at its core, protective. He is angry on behalf of the public that has been lulled and lied to. That righteous anger has moral weight precisely because it isn't cynical. It's grounded in a nearly old-fashioned belief that words should correspond to deeds and that leaders should be accountable to the people. The essays thus resurrect a moral framework often absent from technocratic or partisan analyses. Winter seems less interested in left vs right than in truth versus falsehood, courage versus cowardice, fundamental ethical binaries. This imbues even his policy critiques with a spiritual dimension. For example, No Claim Without a Chore, which describes a stormy town hall meeting, implicitly contrasts passive citizenship with active responsibility. The title itself is a moral axiom. You have no right to the benefits of community if you shirk the labor of maintaining it. By painting the scene of citizens gathered under leaking roofs and flickering lights to air grievances, Winter both appeals to our emotions, the humble dignity of local civic engagement, and our reason, the realization that democracy is work. The moral thesis, democracy only works if we all do our chores, is never baldly stated. It emerges from the narrative and the resonant title, lingering as a challenge to the reader. In sum, these essays are not merely intellectual exercises, though they are fiercely intelligent. They form a sustained moral inquiry, enlivened by storytelling and fortified by emotional honesty. Winter's willingness to be openly moral in his writing, to use words like soul, truth, mercy, holy, without irony, sets him apart from many contemporaries. There is a refreshing earnestness beneath even his most lacerating critiques. In a cultural moment drenched in irony and nihilism, Winter's blend of critical thought and moral passion offers a bracing tonic. It feels useful in the deepest sense. It challenges the reader not only to think differently, but perhaps to live differently, whether that means resisting digital temptations, engaging more honestly in civic life, or simply treating the stranger on the corner with a bit more curiosity and care. Originality and contribution to intellectual life. Given the range and depth of these essays, it is fair to ask, are they saying something genuinely new, or merely rephrasing familiar critiques in flowery language? Having immersed in all 20, one can confidently argue that Winter's work is original, not necessarily in each individual insight. Few problems under the sun are entirely new, but in how he synthesizes and articulates the currents of our time. His voice is distinct, his approach daring in its breadth, and his knack for metaphor and synthesis yields formulations that lodge in the mind. In an information ecosystem often defined by hot takes and fragmented commentary, Winter's essays stand out as erudite long-form arguments that defy easy categorization. They are as comfortable discussing ancient Athens or 19th century Iran as they are parsing TikTok trends. This interdisciplinary fluency allows Winter to draw connections that feel fresh and illuminating. For instance, who else would connect a White House press strategy to the legend of King Ludwig's swan castle, as Winter does in Ballroom for a Swan King? The very audacity of that juxtaposition, Washington, D.C. and Wagnerian Bavaria, catches the reader off guard, and in that moment of surprise, a new understanding cracks open. The essay's concluding concept of architectures of anesthesia is a strikingly original way to describe what others might call bread and circuses, or smoke and mirrors. Winter isn't content to use the standard idioms. He coins new ones that carry his specific meaning. Likewise, his description of Kamala Harris as fluent in the dialect of consequence-proof politics, or of political sloganeering as lullabies for adults enriches the public lexicon. These phrases encapsulate truths about our leaders and media environment in ways that readers will not have encountered before. That originality of expression can shift perspectives. It arms the public with a sharper vocabulary to call out deception and self-delusion when they see it. In this sense, Winter's work is intellectually useful. It doesn't just diagnose problems. It gives us language to discuss those problems more incisively. To adapt one of his own metaphors, he's trying to fit a function to the chaos of contemporary life, to find a line of meaning through the scatterplot of events. And the function he fits often reveals patterns others miss. Furthermore, Winter's integration of the spiritual into socio-political critique feels like a meaningful contribution. He is not afraid to ponder questions of meaning, grace, or the human soul, even as he talks about algorithms or economics. In The Arrow and the Animal, he steps back to prehistory, imagining the dawn of language and worship in a Paleolithic cave. The essay contemplates whether the first human words were born of reverence. Did worship and language start together? It pointedly asks. By linking this scene to the present, the piece eventually loops to how modern people kneel before different altars of data and power. Winter adds a layer of depth to our understanding of technology and faith. He suggests that the urge to find meaning and pattern, which once might have led a hunter-gatherer to see gods in the wind, now might lead an office worker to see salvation in an AI or a political movement. This long arc of perspective is rare in today's commentary. It invites readers to see our dilemmas not just as political or technical problems, but as existential ones that humans have always faced in different guises. In doing so, Winter's essays foster a kind of intellectual wholeness. They refuse the silos that separate economics, politics, psychology, and spirituality, opting instead to treat societal issues as fundamentally human issues that must be understood in full cultural and historical context. The public, if willing to engage with these demanding pieces, stands to gain a richer framework for interpreting current events. There is an implicit educational project running through Winter's work. Many essays carry a subtle tutorial quality. One might learn about the history of French schools in Iran, the beekeeper's French, or the political aftermath of Napoleon III's coup, Victor Hugo, the man who wouldn't shrink, or the concept of dopamine rewards, the signal we feed, in the course of following Winter's argument. Yet these forays never feel tangential. They are marshaled to serve his central theses. The result is an elevation of discourse. Winter seems to trust the reader's intellect and attention span, a trust that is itself meaningful in a media culture dominated by simplification. By reading his essays, one senses one has participated in something more akin to a seminar or an intense conversation, rather than passive consumption of opinion. This is a noteworthy achievement. He has used the newsletter format to deliver what are essentially deeply researched, idea-dense journal articles or sermons, complete with section breaks and, often, an almost symphonic structure of development. Spiritually, too, there is a contribution here. Winter's later essays especially, like Mirage or The Bar or The Unavailability of Love, touch on the inner life in ways few contemporary political writers do. He grapples with despair, hope, loneliness, and transcendence, not in abstract, but through concrete scenes. The devil does not need to rage. He needs only to withhold, he writes in The Bar, or The Unavailability of Love, capturing in one line the peculiar emptiness of modern social spaces where connection is tantalizingly withheld. In Mirage, he speaks of the ache and its strange music that remains when even the saints tire of prophecy. These are not the typical preoccupations of policy journalism or cultural critique, and their presence in Winter's oeuvre adds a dimension of solace, or at least shared grappling, for readers who feel, as many do, that the crises of our world are not only external, but deeply internal. Winter essentially validates the spiritual or existential distress of living now, the hunger for meaning amid chaos, and addresses it on its own terms. That is both original and useful, for it bridges two domains often kept separate, the public and the personal, the worldly and the spiritual. In Elias Winter's essays, they converge. Endurance and legacy. Will Winter's words last? A critical appraisal must finally reckon with whether these essays have qualities that might let them endure beyond the immediate context. There is always a risk that topical writing, no matter how insightful, fades as its moment passes. Winter himself is clearly aware of writing in a specific historical inflection point, possibly the twilight of certain American certainties. He often writes from the edge of empire, diagnosing a decline in real time. But the very skill with which he ties current concerns to enduring human questions suggests these essays could transcend the moment. Indeed, they often read more like chapters of a timeless inquiry than like dated reactions to 2025's headlines. By design, Winter imbues even his most timely subjects with historical depth and philosophical breadth. The invocation of Weimar Germany in the Harris essay, or of ancient ritual in the propaganda essay, or of mythic archetypes in the technology essays, means that readers in a future decade could still find resonance and wisdom here, even if the specific names, Harris, Trump, TikTok, etc., have receded. Stylistically, Winter's writing has the kind of polish and intensity that marks enduring essayists. His prose is dense with meaning and memorable lines. It invites quotation. One can easily imagine anthologists or editors of serious journals finding in Winter's work quotable distillations of the early 21st century zeitgeist. For example, his characterization of our economy of distraction, multi-escaping through tasks and tabs, or his lament that we will forgive anything if it earns, as he remarked after describing Ludwig II's posthumous rehabilitation, are one-liners that carry truth beyond their immediate setup. They could find themselves in essays or books decades hence, cited as keen observations of this era's psyche. Furthermore, because Winter frequently engages with historical comparisons and foundational questions, his essays do not feel tethered to transient news cycles. Victor Hugo, The Man Who Wouldn't Shrink, for example, is mostly historical narrative about moral courage in the face of authoritarianism. Its lessons about the artist's role in politics and the individual's stance against tyranny are evergreen. Similarly, The Beekeeper's French documents cultural and linguistic change over a century. It stands as a thoughtful piece of cultural history as much as commentary. Such essays could be read years later as informative and reflective works in their own right. It is also worth noting that Winter's refusal to chase virality or mass appeal, the very principle he articulated in On Silence and the Work, not the Market, may paradoxically aid the longevity of his writing. By not orienting his work to the whims of the algorithm or the like button, he has produced essays that don't bend to contemporary fads in language or reference. There is a classicism to his style. He favors complete sentences and developed metaphors over tweetable buzzwords. If anything, he aligns more with the tradition of 20th century essayists or pamphleteers, albeit updated with fresh context. This classic quality means the essays might age well. They already read as deliberately removed from internet slang or ephemeral pop culture references. When he does mention something like YouTube or Slack, it's with a critical eye, not as an insider nod. Thus, as long as the fundamental issues, truth and falsehood, community and isolation, technology and humanity, remain of interest, Winter's work has a chance to remain relevant. The essays might someday be compiled into a book, which could serve as a chronicle of a society at a crossroads and the voice of one who sought to guide it toward honesty. Finally, does the collection feel complete? Has it fulfilled its mission? On this point, the internal evidence suggests yes. By the 20th essay, Winter himself seemed to be turning a corner. The progression from scalding critique to contemplative acceptance in Mirage feels like the conclusion of a long argument or the coda of a sonata. The body of work does not cut off abruptly or trail into incoherence. It reaches a thematic culmination. Winter set out to follow language to its collapse and find clarity on the other side. And with Mirage, he leaves us with a clear, if paradoxical, truth that even our illusions have purpose, but we must recognize them as illusions to draw any grace from them. It is a nuanced, mature note to end on, balancing the unflinching realism he has championed with a compassionate understanding of human frailty. In this sense, the essays achieve a kind of narrative closure. While the problems they address are far from solved in the world, the inquiry itself has been carried through to a thoughtful resting place. One closes the series of essays not with a feeling of abrupt abandonment, but with a contemplative pause, as if at the end of a challenging but deeply rewarding journey. Whether Elias Winter will be remembered in years hence is ultimately a question time will answer. But the qualities that often mark enduring writing, intellectual depth, moral intensity, stylistic distinctiveness, and a willingness to tackle the big questions, are all present in spades throughout these essays. In grappling so fiercely with the dilemmas of truth and meaning in our time, Winter has created a work that, at the very least, will stand as a significant testament of one writer's effort to refuse to end the lie, to echo the title of one of his earlier works, and to speak clarity into confusion. The lasting image of these 20 essays is of an author who stood at the crossroads of a faltering empire, listening to the cacophony of media and propaganda, and responded with a voice at once fierce and humane. That voice insists that even as the drums of distraction beat and the mirages shimmer on every horizon, there remains in us a capacity to seek truth, and perhaps in that seeking, to find not certainty, but a measure of grace. This is a contribution not just to public discourse, but to the literature of social conscience. It seems likely that as long as readers value finely wrought, courageous writing, Elias Winter's essays will find new eyes and continue to provoke, challenge, and inspire. Conclusion. In conclusion, the last 20 essays of Elias Winter's Language Matters form a coherent and consummate body of work, one that indeed feels complete in its arc and fulfilled in its intent. Winter set out to perform an autopsy on the language of our civic life, and, in doing so, to resuscitate the possibility of honest speech and genuine understanding. Through penetrating analysis and imaginative empathy, he has added a bold voice to the public conversation, one that is unafraid to name falsehood as falsehood and to demand something higher from our politics and ourselves. Intellectually, he has reframed debates with originality, giving readers new tools to think with. Spiritually, he has dared to ask the ancient questions of meaning that underlie our modern dilemmas, offering both sobering and redemptive insights. Such work is both meaningful and useful, cutting through the noise to remind us of what is at stake in our words and our choices. Will these essays endure beyond their moment? All signs within the text point to yes. They are built on a solid foundation of history, literature, and moral philosophy that lends them a timeless quality. And in their pages, one finds that rare thing, contemporary commentary with the soul of literature. Decades from now, a reader could pick up Winter's essays and not only learn what it felt like to live in America in the mid-2020s, but also be prompted to reflect on perennial human concerns, truth, power, community, faith, that remain as urgent as ever. If the measure of enduring writing is that it speaks to people who come after, then Winter's work has the needed elements. In the quiet after reading these essays, one senses that their mission was not just to critique this passing moment, but to call forth a more enduring consciousness in each of us. By that measure, Elias Winter's Language Matters has been a resounding success. It is a collection likely to be remembered, discussed, and revisited, a fierce beacon of clarity lit in a foggy time, with a glow that just might outlast the twilight of the empire it surveyed.